Good evening, and welcome to our lecture series. I'm Morgan Brown. I'm president of the Society for the Preservation of Canada's Nuclear Heritage Incorporated. And we're doing a series of interviews with nuclear pioneers. These ones are here in Deep River. And tonight, I'm very pleased that Al Rose is going to talk to us. Where was your early life and education, and what brought you to the nuclear industry?
I was no academic. I've always been a jack of all trades and a master of none. On the other hand, if I decide I want to do something, I do. And back in high school, just after the war, we were associated with the Grace United Church, and both my wife and I went to Nutana Collegiate. She graduated from there in 1932 as the senior pin, which means that she was athletic and good looking and academically good. I was never any of those things. Well, I was athletic, but you know, my dad, when I bring a report home and it ended up a D, he never worried too much because he said, "Oh well, it'll be B next time." I did what I had to do, you know, get through high school. At any rate, during that time as well, I had started in Cubs at Grace Church, and I had one of the best scoutmasters that ever existed, and so I ended up being his assistant at the 12th Saskatoon Troop at Grace Church. And one of the things we had was one of the first senior scout patrols in Canada. And Sam and Elgin Horton were both members of that patrol, and of course they both ended up as vice presidents of Ontario Hydro in their nuclear power department. But Margaret's grandfather was the organist and choir director at that church as well. And he was interested in the scout troop, so he and I knew each other before I got together with Margaret. But it is written out a lot more accurately than I'm saying it now, but we had a very active young peoples, and I was a little older, but being the head of the Scouts and one thing and another, and knowing her grandfather, we had a large group of friends, very good friends, and we spent a lot of time together doing various things. I knew Margaret, of course, and she knew me from a very early stage, but when she graduated as senior pin at Nutana, she was an extremely tall girl, just short of 6 feet. And you can see me, I was 5'8". And she was an academic, and I was kind of a dunce. And so we never really had much to do with each other. But as time went on, I got a job as a lab technician with NRC at the university in Saskatoon.
The National Research Council.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
and worked for Dr. Salins on wheat starch and proteins. And after several years, I went to Salins and I said, maybe I should go back to school and do something with my education. And he said, yeah, he said, do that, but he said, don't take pure chemistry, because if you want to come back to NRC, they always hire from Ottawa. And unless you're top of the class, you won't even get a look. So he said, if you go back to school, take chemical engineering. He says, if you don't make it as a scientist, you'll have a good job anyway.
Okay.
So anyway, then time went on. And about 1954, 55, something like that. I was still hanging around completely unattached, romantically. And about that time, I noticed that Margaret, although she was a comptometer operator with a co-op, and into finance, you know, and that kind of thing. And I thought, well, she's still unattached,
Yeah.
which is ridiculous. But part of the reason is that girls weren't that tall back then. And so anyway, I called her up one night. I said, look, I'm still here. I want to go back to university. You don't seem to be attached. How may we get together? and believe it or not, she said, yes, why don't we? So anyway, she said, well, you apply to go on the University of Saskatoon. It was a little too close for me, so I applied to a University of Alberta. Okay. And she said, well, she wants an engineer. She doesn't, you know, all the girls in Saskatoon wanted an engineer. That's an escape from Saskatoon, you know, which it was. Anyway, so she said, all right, if they accept you and you pass the first year, I'll marry you, which is what happened. And as a comptometer operator, with financial co-op experience, she could step into a job in any city in the country instantly.
Can you explain, sorry, what was her job again?
A comptometer is a mechanical IBM.
Okay.
Before, the funny thing is, later on I worked with the first one that ACL had.
The first digital computer.
A computer.
Yeah.
And you had to punch your own cards and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I passed the first year. I was up at, not at the top of the class, but in the first 10. So she said, okay, so we got married. And she then moved to Calgary and immediately into a job. So we never had to starve. All the way through that, I lived off my wife's income because I was penniless. I had absolutely nothing. Anyway, and so that got us to 1960 when I graduated. And there were no jobs for engineers anywhere in the West. And so we ended up in Sarnia. I working for the Polymer Synthetic Rubber Corporation, and Margaret working for Mueller Brass. They make toilets and that kind of thing. Anyway, so new engineers were not paid all that much. She was making more money than I could. Anyway, one of the first jobs they gave me, they put me at the butyl synthetic rubber plant, and they said my job was to write a hazards manual for that plant. And I took another year and a half doing that. And what I found out in that time is it was a very hazardous place to work. And all of the workers there were very well paid. And they didn't really care about the risks. They were living a high life, even though they weren't engineers or anything like that. They were just guys. But they all had golf clubs, and they had boats out on the lake, and one thing and another. And they all knew that they were going to die in their 50s, which they were. They always did. And so I wrote that hazards manual, and I submitted it and resigned. And the reason I resigned was I wanted something a lot safer, like the nuclear business. And of course, Sam and Elgin Horton were already at Chalk River.
Oh, yes.
And so was a guy by the name of John McManus. And so I applied to AACL, and they took me on. Incidentally, we spent the summer of 1959 at Chalk River. I was helping to operate the evaporator for the
Was it for the plutonium processing?
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And one of those blew up before I got there.
1950, yes.
Yes, and I knew very well why it blew up, and I wanted to make damn sure it wasn't going to blow up on me. Anyway, so I did that in 1959, and Sam and Elgin were still there. We had a good summer, you know. But then I went back and next year, and I graduated. And so by the time I resigned Polymer, I had already contacted AACL, and they offered me a shift operator job at NRU. So I took that. And being the way I am, I really couldn't stand the shift work. So at one point, I made an aborted try at teaching school. And I was a good scoutmaster, but I was not a good teacher. And so I ended up going back to AACL and joining them at Sheridan Park. And that's where I met the first IBM computer. It wasn't at Sheridan Park, it was down in Toronto. But anyway, I worked there for some time, and somewhere along in there, John McManus called and said, "Why don't you come up and join the Atomic Energy Control Board?" He said, this is really an interesting place. And which I did, actually. And so by that time, I wasn't really, well, I had had the time at NRU, and my son Peter ended up 25 years as shift operator at NRU, and he loved the shift work. He loved operating the reactor, you know, that kind of thing. Very good engineer, a lot better engineer than I ever was. Anyway, so that's kind of how I got into the beginnings, and I was kind of old for the job, but it all worked out very well. I was at the control board for a while. The funny thing about the control board, it was all military. Oh. And I am a completely non-military person. And John Jennings, John McManus, they'd been in the Korean War.
Oh, have they?
And the only reason some of them got out alive was the Americans got them out of there. So from then on, from their point of view, the Americans couldn't do anything wrong, and which is, I think, a mistake. However,
and of course, I think, was it the first head of AECB was Andrew McNaughton, wasn't it?
Sorry?
Andrew McNaughton, wasn't he the first head of?
Oh, yeah.
And he was a military guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
They were all military except me.
Okay.
And at one point along the way, John came to me and said, "Are you nervous in the service?" And I said, "Well, to begin with, I'm not in the service, and I won't ever be, you know." And yeah, I wasn't happy with the way things were going. And along in that period, I thought the AECB and External Affairs were doing a lousy job of promoting Canadian nuclear power, particularly the CANDU. And so I went back to AECL, and I ended up, of course, eventually there as the Director of International Relations, which I was when I finally retired.
Okay.
Yeah.
Back to AECL then, and Director of International Relations. So how did you get into that area of work?
Oh, well, that's because with the AECB, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty came along.
Yes.
And I went to Vienna for 3 years as an inspector, and responsible for most of Western Europe and in India,
Mm-hmm.
and Japan, and so I with the international agency, I went on all kinds of those inspection trips.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, Margaret raised our 2 boys in Vienna.
Oh.
But
So in that time, you said you were in India, and of course, Canada sold the Cyrus reactor to India, and then they blew up a bomb in 1976.
boy, that's a very short.
Or 74. 1974. Yes, 74. Sorry.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If we're talking about India, the AECB, when I was there, wrote the agreement for Canada and India. Unfortunately, our external affairs, including Pierre Elliott Trudeau, took that and went and talked to Indira Gandhi in India. And Indira Gandhi's English was a lot better than Pierre Trudeau's. And they changed a couple of words. So what we ended up with was a thing that, an agreement that only applied to the only applied to the, not the fuel, because they knew very well that the Indians could never possibly make their own fuel for that reactor. The Americans provided the heavy water for that reactor.
Yes.
And then they kept absolutely silent from then on, when the bomb went off in India, and let Canada take all the blame for that.
Okay.
But the fact is, the Indians, once they had that thing that only applied to the fuel that we put in the reactor, immediately made their own fuel. I don't know where they got but it was good. They took all of our fuel out and stored it. Okay? So we never had any handle at all on that reactor. And it's because External Affairs, AECL, completely, absolutely underestimated the Indians. The Indians didn't do anything wrong. They did exactly what they signed to do.
They didn't break any agreement then?
No, they
Oh,
didn't break any
okay.
agreement at all. Pakistan was a little different, but I never got into Pakistan myself, because the IAEA would send me to India, and then Pakistan wouldn't let me into Pakistan at all.
Of course, they were enemies.
Yes,
yes.
they were enemies.
And Canada cut off India and Pakistan from any further nuclear cooperation in 1976, I think it was. It took a
Yeah.
couple of years
Yeah.
for that to happen. So then you then returned to the AECB from after serving with the IAEA?
Yes, for a while. And did I tell you that I created the Canadian nuclear materials accounting system?
No, tell me.
Yes, and applied it. It's still operating. The funny thing about, and the IAEA was bad this way because they had to account for nuclear material, and most of the people that countries sent to the IAEA as inspectors couldn't even balance their own books. I never balanced my own books either. My wife does that. I mean, she knows how to do it. But the fact that you might have some idea about accounting for money does not apply at all to nuclear materials or any other materials. And the Canadian companies involved in the first reactors and one thing and another. As far as they were concerned, all that nuclear fuel was just the same as coal. They were interested in how much it cost and what they might get for it. But of course, there wasn't anywhere to sell it at that time, so they just stored it when it became used. But the IAEA was trying to balance all these books of all these countries, all of which were doing exactly what Canadian companies were doing. They were treating it like coal. They weren't worried about the radioactivity or anything else. They'll fix that later, you know. But if you're going to try to account in detail for something like nuclear material in powder form or any other form, you can measure it all right, but there's always a plus or minus.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that's the way it is. Nothing can be measured accurately unless it's money, penny by penny,
Mm-hmm.
but not material. There is always a plus or minus, and as time goes on, the pluses and the minuses don't balance out. One of them gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and all kinds of inspectors at the IAEA, honest to God, and at the AECB, honest to God, believed that that material, particularly if it was plutonium or something like that, or high enriched uranium, was somewhere. It wasn't anywhere. It was just uncertainty in the measurements, which you cannot avoid.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I set up this for the ACB, this system that still works, but you still get, particularly when you run a thing like they were doing at Chalk River, extracting plutonium from spent fuel, you know, eventually, when looking at those books, all of a sudden, some of the guys at the AECB, without mentioning names, started to believe that those numbers meant something, and if we didn't find it, soon it was going to become critical and blow things up. Well, sorry, I'm not that stupid, you know, that it doesn't work that way. Those are just numbers on a piece of paper, and they don't mean that there's anything out there that you can find. And the AECB at one point did a lot of running around with instruments, one thing and another, at Chalk River, trying to find this stuff. Of course, they never found it. It's not there. It's just numbers on a piece of paper.
So, so working at the IAEA led you into sort of international. Personally, you were traveling internationally and whatever. So is that what led you into then working for AECL on the international side?
Yeah, yeah. And AECL made some drastic errors, and now I can't come up with his name. Nice guy. But anyway, you know, dealing with Argentina and one thing and another and trying to sell reactors,
Mm-hmm.
Ended up breaking some of the government's rules on on business practices, and got dumped, you know, and once that happened, the whole idea of of Canada supplying power reactors to the rest of the world pretty well stopped. And it was partly AECB's fault, partly External Affairs' fault. External Affairs, you know, they most of them are not engineers either, or even chemists or anything else. They're just bureaucrats, and it seemed easy to convince them that AECL was undoubtedly, even if they couldn't see it, they must be doing something illegal, you know, and that's the way they've operated with the whole Canadian nuclear power business.
I've always found it interesting that Canada, in its nuclear deals and sales around the world, has almost always been dealing with developing countries. We first of all there was India, and then Canadian General Electric dealing with Pakistan for the Canup reactor.
Yeah.
And we also sold an NRX copy to Taiwan.
Taiwan, yeah.
And also then there's Argentina, of course,
Yeah.
and South Korea, which
Yeah.
which at the time was still quite an impoverished country. Then later on it was Romania.
Yeah.
And so it's always been sort of surprising to me that AECL sort of dealt so much. I mean, we sold 2 CANDUs to India as well.
Yeah.
That we always seem to deal with developing countries, like rather than sort of better off countries like European and things like that.
Well, I agree, but I had nothing to do with that side of it.
Okay. So you weren't involved in the sales side of
No.
things in international
No.
relations. Okay.
No.
So what were some of the challenges that arose because of international affairs? You talked about Argentina, for instance. What other difficulties were there, or
Well,
challenges?
Romania.
Okay.
I mean, come on, it was run by a complete nut, and Ceausescu,
Mhm.
yeah,
Nicolae Ceausescu,
Yeah.
yes.
and we'd have meetings with him, and he would dictate when the reactor would come on power.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, I mean, the man was insane, but he had control of the country, and at that time, the Canadian government decided to create CSIS, our own CIA.
Mm-hmm.
So I had all kinds of trouble with them because of my position with AECL and on the international things. And I'd get visits quite regularly from CSIS, and they'd want to know where so-and-so from Romania was. I said, well, I wouldn't have any idea where he is. If he comes here, I would be quite happy to talk to him, you know. But they had this idea that there were these international criminal activities going on. I suspect they still think that, but I was stuck in the middle of some of those, and what can I do? I'm sure that they thought that I must have some illegal things going with some of these other things, but they couldn't pin it down, so. But they tried.
And of course, later on, ACL President Reed Morton, he came from CSIS, didn't he?
Yeah.
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 So. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So you've worked a lot in the problem of proliferation of nuclear materials and weapons, and, with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and things like that.
Yes.
What's your view now about the world situation with nuclear weapons, and where do you see it going?
It's not going to get better. It's not going to get better. But as far as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was concerned, because of the accounting and measurement problems that I've been talking about, there was never any hope of International Atomic Energy inspectors proving anything. But I never expected, I knew that no inspection was ever going to count. A lot of the countries that were perfectly in favor of non-proliferation. For instance, Japan, one company, big company with handling a lot of nuclear material. So I went over with a team from the IAEA, and we walked in, and we had authorization to do that from the company. And what they said, the manager said, was, well, welcome, people. He's just let his entire staff go for a week's holiday. Here's the keys to everything. Have fun. Well, come on. The only way that an IAEA inspection team can write a report is what they get from the people in place doing the work. Mm-hmm. There's no other way to do it. And the Russians over at the IAEA, they just laughed at all this. They certainly went along with the whole thing, but most of the Russians, and there were a lot of smart guys there, they were simply interested in legal industrial espionage. And that was an ideal place to do it. And they didn't need to worry about getting caught. They just laugh and say, well, you want us to pull out of the IAEA? Oh, no. The Americans are funny people. God, they get some funny ideas. But when they do, they can cause a lot of difficulty. It doesn't accomplish anything, but anyway, the reason that countries who signed the NPT never developed nuclear weapons is because they never intended to in the first place. And most of them kind of looked on the whole inspection thing as a bit of a joke, but they were quite happy to go along with it. From a political point of view, it gave them a lot of friends, you know. And for my mind, I think it was worth it for that. A lot of people got to know a lot about the nuclear industry in a lot of those countries, and they didn't have to fight for it. They were welcomed in, and without their help, every one of them, without their help, the inspectors would never be able to write a report that made sense back in Vienna. So that's my opinion about NPT.
Mm-hmm.
But, of course, it didn't affect North Korea. It didn't affect, it should have affected Iran and Iraq. They started in as members, but then the Americans wanted the oil out of there. So, which president, that idiot, claimed that Iraq was trying to produce weapons of mass destruction, which was completely out of the question, but so now we've got Iran. They're not deadly enemies of Iraq anymore, but they're also just under the American thumb because they've got an American reactor out there. Where are we going with this?
Well, I think we were just, what you thought of the future of NPT and where you saw.
I think NPT will continue on, and I think I thought it was a worthwhile thing to do because it lets inspectors from all kinds of member countries go into the member countries, have a look at what they're doing down there, talk to them, become acquainted with them all. From a political point of view, I think it's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It has nothing to do with trying to prove anybody is stealing anything.
Okay.
It can't possibly.
Now, Canada had a relatively small plutonium program at Chalk River.
Yeah.
What you were saying, you were working with the evaporator in 1959. Why do you think Canada never went the route? In 1945, we had the second largest nuclear infrastructure in the world, yet we didn't follow the path to nuclear weapons.
No. I'm glad we didn't.
Me too. Me too. Yes.
I honestly don't know.
Okay.
No, I never got. It never occurred to me or anybody else at the AECB that we might even think of doing that. Certainly AECL never thought of doing that.
There were some proposals at the end of the 1960s, I think it was, to actually use nuclear explosives in the oil sands.
Oh, yes.
Did you heard about that?
Yes.
Or you dealt with it perhaps?
There was one idea that they were going to put nuclear explosives all the way along the Panama Canal and blow the whole thing. And man, would they ever have wrecked the globe if they'd done that? Then there would be nothing to stop the water from the Pacific and the Atlantic from going back and forth. Fortunately, people that might have been able to supply explosives like that were smart enough to not get involved.
Okay. Yeah. I seem to recall someone I knew quite well, Fred Boyd at AECB. Did you know Fred?
Oh, yes.
He was quite a character. I got to know him quite well over the years. But he was involved in assessing some kind or some kind of safety related to the proposal by, I think it was Richfield Oil, to plant nuclear explosives in the tar sands and to heat up.
Okay, that's possible.
Yeah, okay,
I never got involved in that,
Yeah, okay.
but
The AECB was quite a small organization in those
yes.
days, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was. It's no longer.
No.
It's
no.
a lot bigger. When I joined the AECB first, God, I think there were only about a dozen.
Oh, it's that small?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
George Lawrence, I presume, was
Yes.
there.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's right.
So, finally, sort of back to your more personal life. Apparently, you've aside from your scouting side of things, which I was quite interested to hear. I did several years of hard time as scout leaders and
Oh,
cub
yeah.
leaders and beavers and
Yeah.
venture guidance. A very enjoyable time actually doing that.
Yeah.
I believe I had your grandson in Cubs or Scouts at one point, I think, Colin. So,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, Colin.
You even wrote a book about.
Oh
Your-
yes. You don't have one of those books?
No, I don't know.
You'd be quite welcome to one. I've got a bunch of them still at home.
Oh yeah, yeah. I
Um,
would like that.
When I wrote it first, I had expected that Scouts Canada would maybe pick it up and distribute it, but then I finally found out that Scouts Canada was essentially bankrupt, and and we're not interested in picking up a book and getting it produced. And I had hoped that it might go around to most of the scout troops in Canada, because it's a good book. It's a good book, but it's not a how-to. It's a anecdotes of my time in the field, and I've been in the scouting field since I was about 12. So.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
anyway.
I never did it as a child, but
Yeah.
I ended up doing quite a
Yeah.
bit when I was an adult
Yeah.
with my boys, but also with a lot of others.
Yeah.
It was a
I
good time.
became a scoutmaster at Grace Church at the age of 18 because the scouter that I came up under got transferred to Regina. And so the group committee said, can you run the troop until we find a proper adult? So I'm still kind of running it. Once we retired, we came up here, and I knew there was a perfectly good scout group going up here, and I just stayed out of it.
Okay.
It was time to go on to something else.
Right. Right. Well, I think that covers just about everything I had down here. We've sort of brought it back from your starts in Saskatoon
Yeah.
and with scouting there, and
Yeah.
brought it right back. So.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time tonight and sharing some of your stories and your thoughts about your time in Canada's nuclear business. So thank you very much, Al, for what you've shared tonight.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Yeah.